Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. While some of the audience members still log on, I'll just introduce myself. My name's Julianne and I'm the Senior Trade and Investment Commissioner for Trade and Investment Queensland, China. I'm delighted to moderate today's session, run in partnership with the Australia-China Business Council Queensland Chapter and TIQ. So today we have three amazing presenters. Mr. Mark Tanner from China Skinny, who's currently joining us from Wellington in New Zealand. A good morning to Mark. And Professor David Kelly, Director of Research from China Policy, and Ms. Philippa Jones, the Managing Director of China Policy, who both are joining us from Sydney today. So a warm welcome to Philippa and David. We're really delighted to have your support and contributions today, and let's have a good chat about China. If our webinar, because we've got so much to cover, we may be a wee bit over an hour, so bear with us. We'll do our best to stick to time, but it could be an hour and 15 of content for you. And through our speakers' chats today, we will touch on business trends, impacts of China, especially around how China is progressing down the road to recovery from COVID, including some interesting data on consumer behaviour and business sentiments from China Skinny. Then we're going to jump up to a helicopter view of China's economic recovery and sectoral insights and policy leads through Philippa and David's commentary. We're going to skip over sectors. We won't go too deep in any great detail, but we will cover some sectors that are of equal importance to Queensland and China today. You can post questions during the webinar. We'll do our best to attend to them. But for those with a particular interest, please contact us through TIQ's website or social media or email if you have pressing issues that you'd like to discuss further. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over and introduce our first presenter today, Mr. Mark Tanner. He's going to set the scene and the context for our discussions. So Mark's the Managing Director of China Skinny. He's provided China market growth strategies and research to hundreds of brands, including the likes of Nike, Coles and Woolies, IKEA, and Tourism Australia. He's also a columnist. He writes for Reuters, Bloomberg, and Forbes, and he writes a widely read newsletter, China Skinny, as well as presenting regularly on webinars run by other players, including the federal government. So it's a warm welcome to our adventurer and our explorer, Mark, and I'd like to hand over to you for our granular look at business and consumer sentiments and trends.
Thank you, Julianne. So I guess I'll kick right into some of those stages that we've been following since the COVID really kicked in mid-January in China. And I think you'll see a lot of similarities with what's happened in Australia, but unlike Australia, China had no warning. They didn't see this coming, and all of a sudden people were just thrown into this house arrest. And there was a kind of a state of shock. There were people almost went into survival mode. And so what they did was they were consuming a lot of news, a lot of media. TV usage went way up. Online usage went way up, much like in Australia. And people just went out and bought the staples. So things like rice, eggs, dairy, UHT dairy, all those things that people do in a crisis. And similarly in Australia, I know Coles had their most high spending day ever, similarly, and highest week, higher than Christmas, when they were at a similar stage, or when you're at a similar stage in Australia. But things, I guess, after a couple of weeks, people started to really kind of get into groove and realize this isn't going away. You've got to get on with your life. So there was a slight return to kind of normalcy. People started working remotely from home. Some of those productivity apps increased by 100 million users, such as Ding Ding from Alibaba. People started cooking. They got a little bit sick of dry rice and noodles, and really started getting a little bit more exploratory in the way they cooked. Similarly, the kids were studying at home, much like in Australia, and things like gym regimes, because people live in apartments, they don't have backyards. People were staying at home and doing their gym, doing their exercise at home, and really consider that important towards staying immune and keeping healthy, which was obviously top of mind with everyone. But now, or since March, things have started returning to normal. People were allowed out with these crazy QR codes. That if you have a green QR code, you're allowed in everywhere, or most places. So public parks were opening. People were returning to the office. Food and beverage was finally opening, but still not like we noticed before. There was a lot more spacing. People were wearing masks and had to register and had to have their temperatures taken. Schools, which is obviously an incredibly important thing in China. When you're sending your kids back to school, you know things are coming right again, and they've been opening since March across the country. Still, some of the, particularly in the big cities, remain closed, and some of the older kids are back, but overall things are looking relatively positive. There's been a real bounce back in sales. It's not what people were hoping for. People were hoping for a bit of a V return, but it's looking more like a U. But there are some certain sectors that are going quite well, such as healthy, fresh products and food, vitamins, etc. Things like cars. People are a little concerned about using public transport, and we saw this with SARS back almost 20 years ago. People drove in cars just to stay away from public places. Volkswagen just released their their April sales, and they're only 2% down on 2019. But not everything's looking so rosy. Travel is still, unfortunately, one of the last ones to bounce back up. And what little travel there is, it's very localized, so very provincial. People aren't really leaving the confines of their city or their province much yet. We've just had a big holiday, the May holiday, and overall spend was down 60% on last year. So still got a way to go, particularly in longer distance travel. So that will obviously impact a lot of Australian in many ways. But we're seeing some real trends in consumer preferences, and they've started emerging over the last couple of months, and we think that they will continue for 1 to 2 to even more years. And the big one being health. And we've seen obviously a spike in the likes of vitamins, but also healthy food. Terms like immunity are incredibly popular. They've popped up a lot more than we'd seen before, even on products you wouldn't expect. Another one is obviously people were stuck at home, and they were treating their home a lot differently. So historically, people have ate out a lot more, but because they couldn't eat out, they had to cook at home a lot more. So some people didn't have the confidence or didn't even know how to cook. So they were streaming cooking shows and just looking up recipes online. And we've seen a real increase in ingredients to cook, half-prepared food, things like that. Also, we've seen a big change in fitness and well-being. So people can't go to gyms, or they're slowly getting back to gyms, but we're spreading. But people are doing a lot more personal exercise, particularly in their homes. So they are really getting into their streaming videos from home, doing yoga and things like that. They can do in a small space. Obviously, there's no sports and things like that, so that's kind of the way they're getting their fitness and buzz as well. But a big thing to watch is just this reflection and purpose. So people, obviously, when they're stuck at home and something as dramatic as this has happened, and I think it's the same all over the world, people really think about what's important to them. And something we've seen more is around things like family, even the pets. People's pets have been a good companion during all this. But people are unlikely to go out and rush out and be buying expensive handbags and watches. They're more likely to do things that are important for them, more likely to help causes. We've seen a lot of the simplicity, a lot of the Marie Kondo type movement. I guess there's a lot of people who are stuck at home, surrounded by clutter. And then all of a sudden they're like, well, I've got to get rid of this clutter, and I want to live a more simple life. And Idle Fish, which is the biggest secondhand platform, had its biggest day ever in March. So you're seeing some real movements in that. People are more prepared to buy secondhand products, etc. Now, the big move is in retail. Obviously, retail is taking a hammering. People were unable to go to the stores and are still a little bit cautious about going into a store and being in a public place. So people are much more likely to shop online. And if you look at the Q1 data, overall sales dropped about 16%, whereas sales of products on e-commerce grew almost 6%. So there's been a bit of a shift. And another thing is that those who are shopping are getting more diverse and more broad. So older consumers, classed as over 30 in China, they used to account for about 49% of all online shoppers, and now it's gone up to 60%. So we expect that will stay, because a lot of the barriers, a lot of the pain points to consumers going online and shopping, it's just a lack of confidence, a lack of habit. But now they're used to it, they're familiar, and they actually kind of like it. We expect them to shop more online. Similarly, lower tier consumers, so they accounted for 57% pre-COVID. Now they're about 69% of all shoppers. So reaching a much broader group of consumers, and a lot of them that were quite hard to reach prior to COVID. Similar diverse commerce. So we're seeing a lot more social commerce. People during the crisis, once they had their food and their shelter sorted, what they really craved was social connection. And the only way to really get that was through social media. And everything that's digital in China will resort to commerce in one way or another. And so social commerce has really taken off. It was already growing rapidly. Last year, WeChat commerce grew about 160%, sales around the $800 million mark, which is about half of what JD.com, the second largest platform. But that's really taken another gear up with this. And you're seeing a lot of traditional retailers that are getting more into some of the social commerce type models. You've seen an awful lot of live streaming, and you're getting people that are doing live streaming sessions selling 200-300 RMB, so about $50 to $60 million in one session. You're getting government officials on there, a lot of CEOs, all these people that weren't on live stream. You're getting pets. There's been almost a 300% increase in animals live streaming. It's really a really entertaining way for people to spend time, and when they haven't got much else to do, and they've really retained that habit. So from a sales channel point of view, obviously online has gone really, has been the go-to platform for a lot of consumers. As a result, we're seeing a lot of consolidation, or we expect to see more consolidation in the market. A lot of these physical retailers are hurting, and we expect that as a result, some of the cashed up tech companies who were already buying up a lot of physical companies, physical retailers, will expand and buy more of these physical retailers and roll out new retail, which they had been doing before, the likes of Hema, which you may be familiar with. We just saw another one of the big e-commerce platforms, Pinduoduo, invest $200 million in Goma, one of the big retailers in China. So I expect we'll see more and more of this, which will lead to further consolidation of quite a fragmented market. Obviously, with the likes of food and beverage and hotels, hospitality really hurting at the moment, we've seen a number of businesses pivot from that trade, that food service, through to more traditional retail, whether it be online or supermarkets. That's the likes of seafood, horticulture, beef, all these types of food products that are much more focused now on those retail channels where people are shopping. Similarly, there's a lot of Australian companies will know this with the Daigou trade, with the buying on behalf, the people that are clearing out the infant formula in the supermarkets. There's going to be less of them now with less students and less tourists in the short term. And as a result, brands are having to pivot away again from those Australian-focused strategies and more to what's happening in China, being on the ground where the consumers and the eyeballs are. Now, communication, before we get into all of this strategy and strategic direction, I think it's really important to get back to that really basic need of communication. And a lot of consumers in China are a little bit uncertain about Australia. They're reading all this stuff about the COVID taking over around the globe, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, but even in Australia, they're unsure. There's a lockdown or a semi-lockdown. and they really need a little bit of reassurance that the products and the things that they love from Australia will continue to come. And we saw a really good example with Hema Fresh, who I alluded to earlier, which is Alibaba's new retail. It's a supermarket who've, I think, been one of the most successful case studies during this pandemic. And they were really early. In late January, they made 3 promises that they won't shut. And there was a lot of concern around food stores shutting, that they will be unable to get new products, etc., and get the food they need. And they also said they wouldn't raise their prices. And that's something a lot of opportunists were doing, particularly in things like hand sanitizer and face masks. The price shot up, but also for fresh food and veggies, etc. And Hema said, well, look, we're going to stick to that, what we've always charged. And another thing is they aim to keep their shelves stocked. So there's no good having the same prices if everything sells out. They did some really great initiatives. A lot of the restaurant workers that were out of work, they used them to make sure they could be working in the packaging and delivery that obviously spiked with COVID. Similarly, they negotiated with all their suppliers and said, look, make sure you're getting your stuff to us as soon as you can, or first ideally. And they got that. And then they took some really localized initiatives, such as in Wuhan, the public bus, which obviously didn't have a lot of people in it. They used that for delivery, and they renegotiated contactless delivery with apartment complexes, but did a really good job. And that was really appreciated. Their user base went up 125%. And I was speaking to the Hema guys a few weeks ago, and they said loyalty has been maintained at a level that they've never seen before, just because people really appreciated those 3 promises. But I think it really reflects on consumers and business, B2B in China really do need to be regularly communicated with. Make sure you are keeping them across what's happening. If you can't meet delivery or expectations, let them know that. But something we've really heard a lot of from our clients is, look, I need to get back to China. I need to maintain this relationship. I need to talk to my buyers, talk to my distributors, talk to my partners. A lot of Chinese don't really want to be talking to foreigners right now. There's a real concern around imported cases. There's a lot of the new cases in China are being from overseas, so they're concerned about foreigners bringing them in or returning Chinese. And with so many Chinese using Zoom now, or not Zoom, some of the Chinese versions, they're quite happy talking to you on these screens, webinars, etc., like we're talking now. So really important to keep up that communication. It does not have to be face to face. And then to finish, there's been a lot of rumours, a lot of myths going on, and I think they're becoming clearer now as we get through it. But overall, supply chain disruption. Initially, it was very much disrupted. A lot of the ports were not running like they normally do, and that last mile that it was prioritised towards food. But now that last mile delivery is really going. That the carriers, the guys across China delivering the e-commerce, etc., they're all back at pretty much 100%. Even in the cities like Wuhan, they're now looking pretty good. Obviously, the biggest supply chain issue right now is air. Only 1 flight allowed per country, per airline. It really restricts the number of time-sensitive products that can be freighted. But I know the Australian government's very generously subsidised some flights out of Australia that will really help that. Some of the major issues we're hearing are more related to the rest of the world. So obviously with North America and Europe having real issues, that's impacting the global supply chain, the global shipping supplies, container supplies, all that. And so that's obviously going to have an issue. But we are seeing overall in China, things are pretty good and close to normal, particularly for those much needed products, such as food and beverage and beef, fruit in particular. We have seen a slowdown in revenue. Obviously, it's very sector specific. So if you're in tourism, if you're in education, it's not a great time right now. Fresh food overall has been really good, and some of them have been prioritised since February in the ports to get them through. I know that some of the fruit guys have had a little bit of a drop in prices. Prices were holding up like last year pretty well, but in the last couple of weeks, now they've bought the supply. They're seeing a drop, particularly from wholesale, where you're getting a lot of migrant workers who ran a lot of the small fruit shops and things were a bit late returning back to their stores, and so they've dropped demand, which has obviously impacted prices. But overall, things like vitamins, health are really humming along, and getting those right products, etc., and the healthy home type products are doing very well. We expect the main things that are really holding China back right now is just the uncertainty. There's worries about asymptomatic transmission and also obviously imported cases, but more importantly, what's happening in the rest of the world. And obviously when there's factories, China is the world's factory, and the demand decreases from other countries, that's going to impact confidence in China overall. But it is looking positive in many fronts. As I said before, inability to meet Chinese suppliers and customers, don't worry about it. They know what the world's going through. They know flights. They know foreigners aren't even allowed into China right now. So don't stress about that. Just get on the video conference or the phone and communicate. Staff health, overall staff have been incredibly good in China. I'm not aware of a single person working for an Australian brand or even anyone at China Skinny who has got sick. There's spacing in offices around making sure people have their distance apart and wearing face masks in the office, etc. But overall, people are feeling pretty healthy. And staff availability, that was a concern initially, particularly with migrant workers. But now, again, most of them have returned back. Engagement, if you're communicating clearly with your staff in China, that engagement is as good as it's ever been. And I know of a number of firms that have noted that their engagement's higher than they've ever had. Just staff are feeling pretty good about things. They're feeling confident in their company, which is communicated clearly throughout and maintain their jobs, etc. And retention, which has always been a bit of an issue in China, but not at the moment. People aren't really leaving their jobs. They're sticking with a job if they've got it right now, because there is a bit of a rise in unemployment. Again, I spoke of the global economy and the interconnectivity that's impacting things. And then that business model sustainability. And there was some research done by Boston Consulting Group in early March, and they surveyed a whole lot of businesses in China, consumer-focused businesses. 60% of them were pivoting their go-to-market strategy. So it's a case of really adapting, and it's something you always have to do in China because the market is so dynamic, but more so now than ever, adapting particularly from if you're in trade or in old-fashioned traditional retail, probably want to think about looking more at some of those digital platforms from both a marketing and sales perspective. So that's all for me, hopefully not too over time. And if we've got time, I'm sure we'll have questions at the end.
Thanks, Mark. That's great. And I just wanted to shout out to our Queensland audience. Mark and his China Skinny team have done some really great video insights and also some reports on looking at the market in areas that are important for Queensland, for example, beef, seafood, horticulture, also other areas in general like the e-commerce shifts and sport. So those insight videos and reports will be shared through TIQ website and social media shortly. So you'll hear a lot more from the China Skinny team. So thanks again, Mark. That's really great. And e-commerce, as you mentioned, that's really had a second renaissance wave with COVID. So I just thought I'd take this time to also share with some of the participants joining who are in the food and bev and consumer sectors that TIQ has a digital commerce program that we have live now for registration by Queensland exporters. And it's kind of like a boot camp for Queensland exporters. So you get to understand data on what's trending in food and bev and consumer categories. online in China and have a company walk you through your own brand and product attractiveness, and then it ends up in a sales promotion. So there's more info on our website, but I thought I'd just take this chance to mention that. So Mark, thanks so much. We'll go to questions at the end. So we might just shift gears entirely now and lift the discussion up, and we'll segue to our commentary by China policy. So I'd like to take this chance to introduce Philippa Jones, the Managing Director of China Policy. Philippa has had a rich career that spanned diplomacy and foreign trade, working for the Australian government, and now in advisory and research and policy work, as she set up China Policy back in 2011. So Philippa's industry sectoral skills are very broad, everything from trade and agricultural policy, food safety, food security, you name it. Philippa's team covers it and watches it. So today we thought we'd have this fabulous opportunity to hear from Philippa and David, who's the research manager with China Policy. So to shake things up a bit, we'll have a bit of a Q&A discussion with Philippa. So Philippa, thanks so much for your time. To kick things off, Philippa, you know, as the world descends into a financial crisis and we're all looking at what could be next, I'm wondering if we can kick off with your thoughts on if China's bulletproof. You know, what policies are being implemented to keep its economy moving through this period, and what are they aimed at?
Thanks very much, Julianne. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm delighted to be talking to so many of your constituents in Queensland. Now, what I would like to start off by saying is, no, China is not bulletproof, but it's highly resilient. But what I'd first like to emphasise, following on from what Mark's been saying, is that supervision in China is extremely tight. They're very careful about opening it up. There's very strict controls in the workplace. There's strict controls of where people can gather. Cinemas opened up in mid-March, and then a week later they closed and they haven't opened up again. So China is being extremely careful, and it of course looks on the rest of the world with some trepidation and horror to see that we are not following the same type of regime. Of course, we're doing very well at some other countries that aren't. The other thing, of course, is that the Chinese government's got a lot more tools, and it doesn't have quite the same requirement for accountability. So it's not worried. It can be a little bit more forceful in making sure the businesses and the general public are keeping to the rules and the controls that the government think are going to see it through. One of the things that's interesting in terms of what they're doing, their pockets are not as deep as we sometimes imagine. So there hasn't been the handouts to people to go out and spend like we've seen across much of the developed world. They're fiscally conservative, and now the time for that sort of support is over. What we have seen is we've seen coupons. So one of the things that Mark mentioned was the auto industry. And the auto industry to China is very important, and we've seen some concessions going out there. Otherwise, we've seen it in mainly consumer goods. In terms of fiscal and monetary policy, there's a lot of bonds going out. They've changed the reserve ratio requirements. Interest rates are down. In terms of the fiscal response, they are doing what they can to reduce the costs for business. So one of the things that they've done is they have reimbursed 100% of the unemployment contributions that businesses have made. In fact, we did little sums on this, and quite honestly, it wasn't really worth very much. I think, you know, for the whole of last year, it might have been 450 renminbi or something per head. one of the things that we have seen, which has, as Mark has been tracking what's been happening over the last couple of months, at the beginning, when things were in a bit of chaos and they were very concerned, we saw them trying to support companies in the trading sectors, thinking that their markets overseas were going to still be there. As the pandemic has taken hold overseas, we see the focus much more at home, trying to help businesses survive and try to help them reorient to the domestic market. Of course, this pivot to domestic consumption has been going for quite a long time. And again, as Mark is pointing out, people aren't actually getting out there and buying in the same way as they have been doing. One of the things I tend to think about this too is think about what's happening here. Think about how people are reconsidering. And I think that it's very similar in China. Then finally, I would say here is that the focus is on getting people back to work and on jobs. So one of the things that we've seen is that SOEs, government departments have all been told that they must maintain employment. We've also seen that universities are extending master's courses, so there's more study opportunities available. One of the interesting things we've seen public health, of course, comes up as one of those areas that they want students to be in. But overall, of course, I must say that it's a particularly popular option because it doesn't pay very well and there's not much career opportunity. But overall, that's what we're seeing happening to support.
Thanks, Philippa. So you've nicely segued into another area. I'm conscious that we have many audience members who are engaged in the training and education sectors. So perhaps you might be able to share a bit more about what's going on in the education training space in China.
Yes, certainly. Of course, like here, there's been a massive move online. One of the things that Mark mentioned, streaming. And what is interesting, I noticed this morning, is TikTok, which is one of the most popular streaming platforms around the world. Today, there was some news that it's had 2 billion downloads, and it is the most downloaded app across the world. There has been a rash of platforms that have come up in China, and there are some that are better than others. TikTok is a bit of a problem in teaching because it's too much of a distraction, but there are others which are cleaner interfaces that teachers prefer. One of the things that I would say in terms of the education sector is that China is, of course, very advanced in building these platforms, not quite so good at those softer skills. So how to keep students engaged, how to actually run teaching online. And I would have thought that this is an area that we should be thinking about in Australia and how we can support it and what we might be offering online to teachers and institutions in China who want to learn more about the pedagogy behind online teaching. There's been, of course, issues with the Gaokao. Students are very concerned about advantaged, some are being advantaged, disadvantaged, whether schools are going back to the classrooms. So this is as every year, it's one of these areas of concern. As I've just said, there's this more graduate education in China. So therefore, in terms of how Australian institutions can engage, obviously extending MA programs into areas new areas that have become more of a focus than were in the past. So I think that this is an area that we should be looking into. As I mentioned to you before when we were chatting, we're just doing a big piece of work on this, and I'm happy to come back to it if your education team and your education clients out there would like to have more of a focus on education. I think we should come back and do that.
Thanks,
Another
Philip.
dedicated session.
We certainly will be taking you up on that offer. I know that the education training sector is really keen to understand the policy directions and what's going on in China, so that would be particularly useful. And picking on another topic that you raised through, the disruption to the education industry and that we're using more technology now, there's been a lot of reports coming out, Chinese policy direction for science and technology, a push for that. Perhaps you could touch on what that means for China. What are they pushing?
Well, of course, the pursuit of science has been very central to the government for a long time. This goes way back, and it's traditionally technocratic. They associate science with big science and people in lab coats. Interestingly, in the science area, over the last few years, the centre has reformed the funding structure. So the reason that there wasn't that much competition with the developed world in science is because the science effort in China was very fragmented. There was a lot of competition, and different provinces and different localities were funding the same thing. Over the last 5 years, the centre has said, no more of this fragmentation. We're going to have a strategic direction, and we're going to be funding from the centre. And quite interestingly, there's a lot more transparency around science funding. So there's more competition. The big mega projects go out to tender, and you can see online who's applied and what their scores are. One of the things that I would say, of course, is that things have changed very much with the epidemic, and public health is now a priority. So containing, diagnosing, treating COVID-19 has become a focus for public and private research labs, and research funding and medical trials are being fast-tracked. You may have seen that there's been quite a lot of soul searching that went on, because after SARS, there was a big pivot towards better tracking and focusing on public health, but that wasn't pursued, and so they've had to sort of come and resuscitate that area again. Interestingly, what is also happening with this focus on the science and innovation side is that there's been quite a bit of backlash against keeping knowledge back and publishing in international journals, where the old settings were that publishing in international journals was the most, got the most accolades. And if you were published in a peer-reviewed journal that was very high on the citation indexes, you got some massive rewards. So, some things like 1 million RMB if you got it in certain journals and things. So there's a little bit of reflection on how scientists should be communicating their research and working together. Finally, just in science, I'd like to mention that environmental tech is one of the areas that we see a lot of movement in, a lot of interest in, and recently it's a feature of many of the major events. It's one of Xi Jinping's focuses at the moment, that his 3 battles: you must improve the environment, So this is an area that Australia, of course, is very much engaged with China in and should continue to be. And there will be many opportunities there.
Thanks, Philippa. Slightly linked to environment, but on a very different tack, agriculture. What's going on there?
Well, it's interesting in agriculture. It had a big impact initially. There were blockages everywhere. Feed and seed were not getting through, and we saw some really massive problems. I mean, particularly, Hubei was the centre of poultry production, and the feed wasn't getting through, and there was a lot of concern. Xi Jinping even came out and with some very strong directive from on high on getting spring planting done, because the centre was concerned that if seed wasn't sown, then it affected the harvest. That's now no longer a concern. What, of course, was very obvious is that most planting goes on outside and there's plenty of social distancing. Everything's really back up and running in terms of production. However, in agriculture, the issues that they had last year have not gone away. One of the main concern of agriculture at the moment is in pest and disease. So they've had African swine fever, which is not going away. Pork prices are up and down, and mainly up. One of the other big areas of concern is fall armyworm. And fall armyworm affects rice and corn production. And it's resurgent at the moment, and they're very concerned about it. And then on top of that, they've got locusts coming in from Pakistan. So in terms of pest and disease, that is much more where the concern is than in anything that's actually COVID-19 related.
So food security and safety, has COVID reinforced the importance of that for China, not only its domestic agricultural sector, but also in terms of its global connectivity and sourcing?
Well, it's interesting actually what Mark was talking about, online and fresh food. What we have seen over the last few years is it's the rise of the online and the fresh food sector, which has actually enabled better food safety. The problem with food safety in China is food was always too cheap, and there was never enough money in the system to be able to implement good food safety. And it's as it goes online and it gets better packaging and it's easier to trace, we see much better food safety. Food security, of course, is a focus of China it's always at the top of the agenda. They know that the rest of the world cannot feed China. So making sure that they have food security in terms of grain and feed is very important. So, food security is not a problem, and food supply is not a problem in China.
Thanks, Philippa. And another hot topic coming up from China is investment and policies on new infrastructure. So I thought we might just take some time to explain and unpack what is this?
Well, new infrastructure, of course, is the response that everybody expects China to start building roads, high-speed rail, airports, in response to any fall in the economy. What has been happening over recent years, of course, is that they are focusing more and more on science and innovation and on high tech. And what they see, we used to call this sort of smart infrastructure. So it's smart, and it's the smart stimulus. So it's looking at making sure that they're putting the investment into 5G, into Internet of Things, into everything that in China is called Internet Plus. So Internet plus everything, Internet plus agriculture, Internet. But of course, it doesn't create jobs. to the same extent that building another high-speed rail track or an airport. So even though it is very much a government focus and it's part of the rhetoric, it's not really a economic. It's not a response in terms of economic rebound.
So Philippa, if it's not the holy grail for job creation in that, in the traditional sense of infrastructure investment, how is China addressing the unemployment impact of COVID? You touched on a bit early in terms of universities extending and so on. Maybe just a comment there.
Well, it is, of course, what I was saying is that it's not giving away. It's not giving money away to the same extent. What it is trying to do is to support business. So its main focus is on supporting business, and it also has quite a lot with big business and government, as I mentioned. It has quite a lot of persuasive power to make them keep people on, but there will be a lot of unemployment. I heard Mark mentioned a little bit of unemployment. There is going to be a lot of unemployment. And of course, what I would mention here, the biggest concern in China is no longer how they cope with COVID-19 in China, it's how they cope with their loss of markets overseas. And this is the big unknown.
Yes, it is a big unknown for China and other markets indeed, Philippa. So thank you so much, Philippa. That was a really great chat. We covered a lot of ground. Now I'm conscious, perhaps there's one of the other elephants in the room, and perhaps David might be able to comment on this, is later this month, the Chinese Communist Party will hold their annual Congress. And I'm sure China Policy and the team are watching that. And there are some concerns about rising nationalism and the impact or implications that may have for the world. And so with that, David, it's my pleasure to introduce you for China Policy.
Thank you so much. There's a bit of feedback that we will just bring under control. I think someone needs to mute.
No, I've muted myself.
Oh, no, now. Okay, good. All right, David, well, over to you.
Okay. Well, I can add, I believe, to what both the previous...
Still got the echo there.
I think you need to just take your iPad to another room. I want to introduce a word. It's a new word, and I call it PrevCon. In Chinese, you can always glue two bits of words together, and this is prevention and control, and it's in every document. And I have to, in doing my daily translation exercises to keep my brain working, I call it PrevCon. And it's got a special meaning. It's prevention and control essentially of external threat. And this is the kind of nationalism that I think we're dealing with at the moment. Of course, there's always nationalism. It never goes away. It's in the background in every country, and it's very strong in China because of all the history that we know about. But it changes shape from day to day. It's a moving target. At the moment, I expect that meeting later in May will not be strongly nationalistic, and I'll try to explain why. If you're following the daily press, you'll see all discussion of China they're always mentioning a thing called Wolf Warrior. That was a movie 2 years ago, more than that, 4 years ago maybe. Wolf Warrior 2 depicts the Chinese coming to the rescue of a hospital somewhere in Africa that is dealing with a virus infection. And essentially the Chinese cavalry rides in with the UN flag. They come in because the UN has asked them to come in, and and they fix this up and they kick out these very evil looking people who are all, I have to say, Westerners, although there is a good Westerner in the movie, a lady, a doctor, and she is rescued from these evil people. But the word now is used for the very aggressive kind of diplomacy going on essentially between Beijing and Washington. Other people get mixed up in it. Australia has waded in. We got a controversy about asking for an independent inquiry into the origin of the virus. I won't talk about that now. That's still breaking news. I want to come back to something that Mark and Philippa both raised, which is another word, uncertainty. And yesterday, Xi Jinping held a meeting of the Politburo Standing Committee. That's the highest, that's the absolute, that's like the Council of Elrond in Lord of the Rings. It's very high level, and he mentioned this uncertainty. He's not a guy who usually goes in for uncertainty. Uncertainty looks like a cop-out from a leading politician. You invoke uncertainty only in an extremity. But what was so interesting about this was that over the weekend, a very senior Chinese academic, a guy named Wang Shaoguang, who's a senior professor of management at Tsinghua University. You have to remember that most of the Politburo have been to Tsinghua University. That's where the technocrats get their finishing school. And he, amazingly to me, quoted Donald Rumsfeld about known knowns and unknown, and you probably all remember that from about 10, 15 years ago in the Bush, the W. Bush period. They talked about these known knowns and known unknowns. So he is saying that. And then 3 days later, Xi Jinping is mentioning the word uncertainty. So it really does show that this, I believe, will be the theme. That's the kind of, my experience of Chinese messaging is that you will see, in the weeks leading up to these big meetings, you'll see some new words, you'll see some buzzwords. They will be seeded into the public media, and then they will be able to press that button in the big meeting, and you'll hear more about uncertainty. So what does it mean? I think it goes down to this other thing that Mark said, this basic need for communication. The warrior approach has not worked. It has bounced back badly for China. There's a lot more you'll see. There's been cancellation of big projects on the Belt and Road. If you followed that recently, you'll see that big projects in Egypt, Pakistan, these are massive, half a million gigawatt power station in Egypt, and other things in Bangladesh and Pakistan have been cancelled, and people are raising the question of the nature of the debt that they've got involved in. This has been very big in the last week, and I think the China media want to steer away from this, and they are now but at the same time, between a rock and a hard place, it's very important for China to externalize its risks. It sees risk in terms of risk from overseas coming back in. And that's why we saw yesterday in Xi Jinping's talk, he again used this expression, PrevCon, prevention and control of external risk. So I think both Mark and Philippa were spot on with that. So we're seeing it in the top level media. Perhaps I'd rest at this point. There's quite a bit more of that. Oh, let me add one more thing. What this professor of management said, which I think goes to this question of graduates training and education. He said in big underlined comments, there is a need for more research on decision-making under uncertainty. And perhaps we do that well in this country. I have a feeling we do. I feel it's not a new topic. In fact, Rumsfeld got it from somewhere else. He probably got it from someone at Harvard or whatever. And this is now. I looked at this many years ago. I was in the early 2000s. I tried to tell people about uncertainty as a factor in China, and the answer always was, but they will never admit it. The top level never wants to talk about uncertainty. As I said, you know, you're not hairy-chested if you take refuge in uncertainty. But when the situation gets to this level, it's not a bad move. And people recognize that there are different kinds of uncertainty, and part of it comes from the old planning system. That was the doctrine 20 years ago. Where you had market forces, there was less uncertainty. You didn't have to pay managers such high salaries if they were in Zhejiang, because there were clear performance indicators. Whereas in the old planning Rust Belt areas up in Manchuria, in the northeast, you had to pay higher salaries because you couldn't get a good manager to come into that situation. That was one of the things that was noticeable then. So there's lots of repercussions and lots of interest in this topic, and our high-level tertiary sector should be looking at it.
Thanks, David. So we've definitely been on a journey of discussion today, covering everything from consumer and business level sentiments and trends through to economic and policy indicators, and through David's lens, we've just discussed what could be in store later this month at the annual Congress in China. Just to wrap up, I just have a question for all the panelists. We have, because we've covered so much, one thing we haven't talked about is China's opening up and CIIE. So perhaps if I can just hand back to Mark, from a business perspective, what's being said about CIIE, which is China's flagship event, November this year? Mark, what are you hearing at the business level in regards to the importance of CIIE and what that might present for international markets as well as companies?
Yeah, it was very interesting. And if we look back to the Canton Fair, which I think was on this month or maybe late last month, they all of a sudden announced that would be happening when it was clear that no one would be traveling to China during a pandemic. But I think it's more representative, more symbolic that the CIIE, they need to show that, yeah, China is again leading the world. They're going to, there's a lot of, as both Philippa and David have spoken about, there's a lot of growing anti-China sentiment, and something that China does very well, and it is very positive for the world, is importing and trade. And I think that's the whole point of CIIE. That's why it was started 3 years ago. So they're going to do everything they can to make sure it happens, and it's a roaring success. The CL, the trade show, the biggest one, are just specific to food and hospitality. That was shifted to September this year. So I'm guessing that they are hopeful that things will be okay by September, and that will obviously run into the start of November. I know the Australian government is betting on CIIE as well, and they're doing some offline initiatives leading up into the big show.
Yeah, Mark, that's true. So one quick follow-on question. COVID has disrupted communication and relationship platforms, particularly with a traditional Asian market like China. Are you seeing more online business matching, more online engagement by Chinese private sector and SOEs and government?
It's a really good point. I think there should be a lot more than is happening within China. Yeah, the number of users of these online productivity tools has increased by over 100 million. So a lot of these businesses that weren't set up in the past are now set up and have the infrastructure so that they expect to talk on these platforms. But I think a lot of Western businesses haven't been as responsive as they possibly should have. A lot of them have got their own issues to deal with. But I think going forward, and particularly in relation to CIIE, it's really important to start those discussions and that rapport building 6 months out, so about now, rather than waiting until November to try and do something spectacular in the space of 5 days when everyone else is trying to. So yeah, and obviously the way to do that is through video conferences right now. So really good point to raise to get onto it.
Thanks, Mark. So before I wrap up and summarize, just a question for all the panelists. What should we keep our laser focus on watching out for China? What indicators or what key trends or concerns should we be watching? So maybe to you, Mark, first, and then we'll go to Philippa and David.
Yeah, formally I would have said schools returning, because obviously people take a lot of care of their only child and put it above everything. But that's starting to happen. I would now say the next big indicator will be letting foreigners back in. Right now we're not allowed in. And I think when that happens and they start allowing more than one flight per airline per country, that would be a sign that they're feeling a little more comfortable about Australia and the rest of the world. Whether that happens in stages, Australia may get in earlier than the likes of America, just because things are looking a little more rosy down here. But yeah, I think that will be a good telltale sign.
Thanks, Mark. And Philippa and David, what are you keeping your team's vision glued to?
Well, funnily enough, what I would say is that I would look to the rest of the world. As I was saying, China knows what it's doing. We know where it's going. It's very much under control. What is happening in the US and whether the US can control COVID-19 is going to have a big impact on whether China can get back to work and people can earn enough to be able to buy a diversified number of goods that would include things from Australia.
David?
The issue that is, I think, of great significance, and it's another Chinese term that's in the media every day, and it's called buck passing, passing the buck. China is telling us that we're passing the buck. And on the other hand, people like the Chinese ambassador to the UK tells the UK that it's suffering from a political virus. And other experts tell those Belt and Road countries that they're suffering from a policy virus. They are supposedly doing everything wrong that China got right. There's a problem here. The buck passing could easily be understood as going the other way. And we have to get to a point where we say, we do wrong stuff too, and you do wrong stuff too. That's what this professor at Tsinghua is saying. He's saying we are all making decisions under maximum uncertainty. That's why I saw this as a step back from the wolf warrior thing. This is going to be a key theme. We've all got to stop passing the buck, but we've all got to admit that we're making decisions under maximum uncertainty.
Thanks, David. On that topic, I've just had a question from the audience, and it's directed to Mark. So, Mark, with the general what is the general feeling in China regarding the West changing attitude towards them? And is there a possibility of more of an exodus of manufacturing out of China? Is your team, are you getting any sense of that?
Well, it's there's definitely much more of a nationalistic sentiment that's been talked about earlier today, and that was already on trend. If you look at things like made in China claims, that was the number of brands that were calling that out was increasing every year. But it has increased for a couple of reasons. One is a lot of the countries are feeling, Chinese are feeling like a lot of the countries are quite unfriendly to them at the moment, particularly America and Australia to a lesser degree. And the other is there's this real pride in how China has coped with coronavirus. So they're seeing their system as incredible, whereas they look at all these other fumbling, apparently world leaders, and they think these guys aren't as good as we once thought. So that will obviously have an impact in some of the other sentiment towards those countries. But as far as manufacturing, yes, there's definitely some manufacturing moving. It's not hit critical mass yet, but the likes of Japan are subsidizing a lot of their manufacturers to leave. South Korea is the same. America's obviously been driving that for quite some time. So there will be some repatriation and some movement down to some of these lower cost economies in the south. But yeah, there's definitely changing times, and I think that is why, to talk about the smart cities, China is really trying to ramp up its efficiencies through technology, so they are just more competitive. It's not a price-based driver as it was in the past. It's more of their logistics. Their cities are just much better equipped to cope with this incredibly unstable world that we live in right now.
Thanks, Mark. So Mark, David and Philip, I really wanted to thank you for your contribution to the discussion today. We've certainly covered a lot. I might just try to summarize our meandering journey. So we kicked off today starting out how COVID has created a time for reflection and purpose for China and other global citizens, and some soul searching. And that's really what's been evident through that is we've seen what's important for consumers, for governments. And there's been some significant changes in consumer behaviour. We've seen a second wave of e-commerce boom, a change in broader groups of consumers, picking up the habit of using e-commerce for purchasing, even lower tier city consumers and old 35 plus consumers. We've seen digital media and social media become more popular, including live streaming fueling that, and sales being quite significant with live streaming. We've also seen some shifts to industries. So for example, in food and bev, we gave some examples where there's been consolidation, M&A activities with e-commerce and traditional retailers. Hospitality sector still hurting. So we've seen some innovation and adaptation by food service companies moving broader into retail and online. We've seen any product or service with an immunity boosting or health and well-being aspect become more popular. There's some key new buzzwords which are even trending at government circles, which is quite unknown for China. The words uncertainty not just about your own economy, but the global economy, asymptomatic transmission. There's also uncertainty about Australia and Queensland's commitment to China and fulfillment capabilities, and the overall bilateral relationship. Some challenges continue in supply chains, particularly with air logistics, air freight logistics, but we're seeing some movement and support from the federal and state governments there. And we've got PrevCon, prevention and control, being top of the list in terms of policy direction for China, looking at spending on new infrastructure, health, education, and controlling employment and unemployment. So that's just a very broad summary of what we've covered today. But for more, please reach out to TIQ, and we're happy to connect you to expert companies, including China Policy and China Skinny. And moving forward, I just wanted to take this chance to flag that we do have 2 more webinars coming up. For those who want to know about IP protection in China, the 12th of May is for you. And for organisations wanting to know a bit more about education training, we do have Austrade's Education Commissioner and the Education Counsellor for China joining us on the 20th of May, together with our Study Queensland colleagues in China. And we will take up China Policy's kind offer too, to deep dive into the education and training space, given the importance for Queensland. So more webinars to come. Information is on our website, and the links you can see on the screen now through TIQ website and social media. I just wanted to thank once again our generous panelists and presenters. This session, the recording will be shared with all participants, including a copy of Mark's presentation. So stay well, everyone. Have a good day, and thank you so much for joining us as part of our China Talk series. It's really appreciated. Ciao.